It started as a dispute over the process for switching gender. It's now a major clash over Holyrood's powers. The First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has promised to vigorously defend Holyrood's gender reforms in court. She's been speaking to the BBC as the UK government formally issued an order to stop the Scottish bill becoming law. The Scottish Secretary, Alistair Jack, says he's acting to protect safe spaces for women and girls. Labour's called on the two governments to work together to find a solution, but not all their MSPs are happy. Here's our political editor, Glenn Campbell.
I call the Secretary of State for Scotland.
This is the moment the UK government stopped Holyrood gender reforms becoming law.
Today, I will make an order under Section 35 of the Scotland Act 1998, preventing the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill from proceeding to royal assent. This order...
Utter shame, the cry from the SNP benches, but the Minister insists there are genuine legal concerns that the Scottish bill could have adverse effects on UK equality law.
Those adverse effects include impacts on the operation of single-sex clubs, associations and schools, and protections such as equal pay.
In Edinburgh, the First Minister accuses him of weaponising the issue and tells the BBC's Chris Mason she will challenge the decision in court.
I can say categorically the Scottish Government will vigorously defend this legislation, but in doing so, we will be vigorously defending something else, and that is the institution of the Scottish Parliament.
Her top legal advisers not publicly discussing the case. But experts think this constitutional clash will end up in the UK Supreme Court.
The court would have to look at two separate points. One, does the Gender Recognition Reform Bill modify the law as it affects reserved matters such as the Equality Act? And second, is Alistair Jack reasonable in his concerns about that, or is he being unreasonable in intervening in this way?
There are political questions too, not least for Labour. They officially supported gender reform here at Holyrood, but are not resisting the UK government's intervention at Westminster, even though that Section 35 order has infuriated some of their MSPs.
It feels like a politically malicious act, and I think it's about time that Viceroy Jack got back in his box.
The Viceroy?
Yeah, I think it's a deeply unusual act. It's an affront to this Parliament, this democratic institution.
Should UK Labour stand up against this intervention?
Yes.
In what way?
Well, they should oppose the intervention by the Secretary of State. The Scottish Labour Party supported the bill. It reflects a commitment in our own manifesto. Our own colleague led scrutiny on the committee. Pam Duncan-Glancy knows more about that than Keir Starmer does, frankly.
What we need now is both governments to sit down and really work out what they're going to do to implement it for trans people. That's what they need.
Holyrood Conservatives generally welcome the UK government's order, but this MSP does not support it and warned the PM it could be a gift to nationalists.
And I felt it important, as a member of the LGBTI community and as a Conservative, to share my views with the Prime Minister. And I hope that they will take those on board.
Did he reply?
Not yet.
Rishi Sunak and Nicola Sturgeon were all smiles when they met in Inverness last week. Now their lawyers are preparing to wrangle over gender law in court.
But away from the increasingly ill-tempered political row going on, what do you think? And how do the groups who campaign so passionately on both sides on this issue feel right now? Our political correspondent Andrew Kerr reports.
For those involved in this debate, the passion brims over. At this stage, a new level has been reached. Politicians on either side and government lawyers are now assessing their positions. Campaigners too are taking time to regroup ahead of a fresh fight.
What people are feeling is just disappointed, and also about a kind of an elongation of what has already been a really, really long period about trying to get this law changed. I mean, I first started working on changing this law about 7.5 years ago, and we finally thought that, we'd achieved it, it was done, and now we're looking at quite a lot of uncertainty around when ultimately a decision will be taken about whether things can go forward.
We're very relieved, and I think women across Scotland are very relieved. We've had contacts from people on all sides of the political spectrum, people who supported independence, people who supported devolution, people who support the union, and they're all really, relieved that the UK government have taken steps to preserve UK-wide equality law.
People not connected to campaigns have been taking in the news. A BBC Scotland survey last year suggested younger people are much more likely to be sympathetic, like some here in Glasgow.
I'm all for it, do you know what I mean? Be who you want to be, I don't really care.
I thought it was quite controversial because people weren't expecting it to happen last night. Came as a really big shock. I think there has been a lot of debate within my peers about whether we think that the bill was a good idea or not, but we fully, once it got past the Scottish Government, we didn't expect that Westminster were going to block it.
I wouldn't be surprised at all if this is challenged at every single basis, because it is not only challenging gender recognition in general, but also the power of the Scottish Government to make their own changes.
And some voters in Aberdeen have been watching their politicians too.
I think the UK government has got it spot on, basically.
Leave people alone, let people live their lives. It's nobody else's business but your own.
It's a massive input of resources for a matter that shouldn't be a used priority.
Questions over gender reform and constitutional arguments are now bound to be played out in court, with voters from across these different spectrums watching with interest. Andrew Kerr, reporting Scotland.
Well, let's speak now to our Westminster correspondent Rajdeep Sandhu and to Glenn Campbell at Holyrood. To you first, Rajdeep. It was pretty rancorous in the House of Commons today when Alistair Jack got to his feet, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. It was definitely one of Parliament's more heated debates down here. And I don't think people will find that very surprising when we are talking about gender, and on top of that, layering on a constitutional row. The SNP were multiple SNP MPs were saying that this was politically motivated, that it was attack on democracy. The Scottish Secretary Alistair Jack was denying that, saying that this wasn't politically motivated, that there were legal reasons why the UK government were using these powers, and also saying that those powers were in the Scotland Act for them to use for such an occasion like this, when they feel like Scottish bills could impact negatively on UK law. Now, the one thing that was hotly anticipated during these debates was the list of reasons to say exactly why the UK government was doing this. There was some agitation that it was published so late in the day, and it's a 33-page document, but it includes reasons like the UK government thinks it would be too difficult to have two different gender recognition systems in the UK, and it also says that there could be less safety for women and girl-only spaces, and they say that could be down to abuse through the Scottish system, which would be easier to change your legal sex, and they say that could lead to what they have described as fraudulent applications.
And Glenn, to you now, this debate is causing divisions between Westminster and Holyrood, but also among the political parties themselves, isn't it?
Yeah, this is not just about a clash between the Scottish and UK governments, between the SNP and the Conservatives over Holyrood's right to legislate in this area. It has also caused divisions within political parties, all the large parties here at Holyrood. In fact, it prompted the biggest ever rebellion that the SNP has faced since taking power back in 2007. Interestingly, talking to one SNP critic of gender reform, they told me they would rather see this bill become law, though they don't like it, they would rather that than have it be stopped by the UK government. But that's the effect of this Section 35 order, and I don't think Nicola Sturgeon's going to sit down with UK ministers and start tearing out parts of it to make it more palatable. Instead, the Scottish Government has confirmed it will consider very carefully this intervention and come back to Parliament with next steps. But ultimately, that means going to court. It could mean a judicial review in the Scottish courts just up the Royal Mile. But ultimately, this will probably be settled in the UK Supreme Court in London.
Okay, Glenn at Holyrood and Rajdeep at Westminster on another eventful day. Thank you both.